Welcome to This Explainer. You know, whether you're tracking global economics, politics, or culture, it feels like all roads eventually lead to the Indian subcontinent. So today, we are going on a truly epic journey. We're going to cover 4,500 years of incredibly dense, multifaceted history. Our goal is to unpack the fascinating story of this region and figure out exactly how its rich, complex past actively informs its massive position on the global stage today.
Okay, let's dive right into this with a massive macroscopic zoom out, 1.4 billion. Let's just pause on that for a second. That is the sheer, staggering scale of modern India. It holds roughly 17.5% of the entire global population, and it proudly stands as the world's most populous democracy. But to truly understand how a nation of this magnitude actually functions today, we have to look backward.
Don't worry though, we are not going to get lost in the weeds here. We've got our journey broken down into 6 distinct eras: ancient roots and empires, the medieval cultural synthesis, colonial rule and rebellion, the fight for independence, building the modern nation, and finally, India on the global stage. And as we move through this, I want you to keep one crucial recurring theme in your back pocket: constant cultural synthesis.
All right, part 1, ancient roots and empires, the foundations of the subcontinent. Let's take a look at the bedrock of Indian civilization.
This timeline right here maps an incredible progression. Around 2500 BCE, you've got the zenith of the Indus Valley Civilization. We're talking about meticulously grid-planned, self-sufficient cities like Mohenjo-Daro. And honestly, it is still mind-blowing to realize that these people had advanced indoor plumbing systems literally thousands of years before most modern cities. Then, 1,000 years later, the early Vedic period kicks off with the Indo-Aryan migration. This brings a whole new language and the composition of the 4 sacred Vedas. Fast forward to 322 BCE, and we see the subcontinent's very first massive political union under the founding emperor Chandragupta Maurya.
Now, what's really interesting here is the contrast between India's 2 great ancient Golden Age empires. On one hand, you have the Maurya Empire. These guys were a powerhouse of administrative organization. They pioneered bureaucratic governance, rolled out bronze coin taxation, and drove rapid economic growth through massive public works projects. On the other hand, a few centuries later, you get the Gupta Empire, which basically took human thought to an entirely new level. Sure, they re-established global trade routes, but more famously, they gave the world the decimal system and the concept of zero, all while carving these breathtaking monumental rock-cut caves at Ajanta and Ellora.
Which brings us to part 2, the medieval cultural synthesis, a confluence of traditions.
So, shifting our focus to around the year 1200 CE, we hit a massive turning point. The arrival of Turks, Afghans, and later the Mongols, who eventually evolved into the Mughals, completely rewrote the landscape. Through the Delhi Sultanate and the mighty Mughal Empire, which really hit its absolute peak under Emperor Akbar, we see 2 massive cultures colliding. But it wasn't just mere conquest, right? It was this profound confluence. Hindu and Muslim traditions blended together, sparking incredible advancements in art, urban planning, and architecture. The purest example is the white marble of the Taj Mahal. It forged a deeply composite culture that was entirely uniquely Indian.
But let's zoom in from the empires to the everyday people. While kingdoms were clashing and merging up top, the masses down below were swept up in the Bhakti movement. This was a totally revolutionary, deeply personal approach to religion defined by an intense, direct love for the Supreme Being. It essentially democratized faith. It gave rise to this beautiful, diverse religious synthesis expressed in local vernacular poetry and local sects that touched daily life across the whole subcontinent. And what's wild is that same vernacular poetry, it is still actively shaping modern Indian music and cultural identity to this day.
Suddenly, global dynamics shift entirely. Welcome to part 3, colonial rule and rebellion, the shift to British power. Let's track this rapid chronological pivot. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama figures out the direct sea route to India. By 1600, the British East India Company is officially chartered in London. And honestly, it's absolutely wild to think that a corporate entity, a literal company, slowly built a total monopoly and a counterfeit empire driven entirely by profit and commerce. This centuries-long buildup of pure economic dominance and exploitation inevitably created a pressure cooker, and the explosive breaking point, the 1857 Indian Rebellion. This rebellion was an absolute watershed moment. Yes, the immediate spark was the infamous rumor about Enfield rifle cartridges being greased with animal fat, but the underlying powder keg was decades of oppressive company rule. This wasn't just some localized battle. It was the birth of a shared national consciousness.
For the very first time, sepoys, which were Indian soldiers, and everyday citizens from all different sections of society united in a mass struggle against one common enemy. Now, the rebellion ultimately didn't achieve full independence, but it did effectively end the East India Company's reign, forcing the British Crown to step in and take direct administrative control.
This ushers in a deeply inspiring era. Part 4, the fight for independence, nationalism, and nonviolence.
So, the crucial point here is how this national resistance actually evolved. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was formed. Initially, it was meant to be this sort of safety valve for educated Indians. It was dominated by moderates who used quiet prayer, petitions, and memoranda to, politely ask the British for reforms. But pretty quickly, a new faction known as the extremists emerged, and the energy completely shifted. They demanded a radical policy of self-help. They basically said, look, if we're going to challenge a global empire, this can't just be a polite parlor game for the educated elite. It has to become a massive, unstoppable movement of the common people.
Enter Mohandas Gandhi. After cutting his teeth as an activist in South Africa, he returned to India and deployed a highly specific, totally revolutionary strategy called satyagraha. Now, this wasn't just passive resistance, it was active, non-violent, law-breaking civil disobedience, and crucially, it was specifically designed so that the poorest, most disenfranchised Indian could actually participate. Think about how brilliant this was. In the 1930 Salt March, Gandhi challenged the British Empire's absolute monopoly by daring millions of Indians to simply walk to the ocean and make their own salt. It was undeniable. It completely broke the empire's moral authority.
Finally, on August 15, 1947, independence was won. But it arrived alongside profound, heartbreaking tragedy. The British Indian Empire was partitioned into two independent dominions, India and Pakistan. This monumental political shift overnight severed ancient trade routes, uprooted millions of lives, and resulted in one of the most complex, devastating, and bloody demographic splits in human history. It forever altered the geopolitical map of South Asia.
Now for Part 5, Building the Modern Nation, Challenges and Triumphs. We're in the post-independence era now, and the monumental task was figuring out how to govern what is arguably the world's most ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse large nation-state.
For decades after independence, India relied on heavily protected, somewhat sluggish markets. But then, a severe balance of payment crisis forced a massive shift. In 1991, to essentially stave off total disaster, the government rolled out aggressive economic reforms. They basically uncaged the Indian economy. They devalued the currency, abandoned their old import substitution model for export-led growth, opened up massive critical sectors like telecom and power to private companies, and allowed up to 51% foreign ownership. This bold pivot is exactly what sparked India's explosive IT and business process outsourcing boom.
And the results? They were immediate, greater than 5%. That was the average annual GDP growth in the 1990s and 2000s. To put that into perspective, that is a stark, staggering contrast to the heavily regulated growth rates of the decades prior. By opening its markets to foreign direct investment and exporting high-value, white-collar services, India catapulted itself from an isolated economy straight into the very center of the world's corporate imagination.
Which brings us to our final segment today, Part 6, India on the Global Stage, a Culture of Synthesis.
Over the last few decades, India has fundamentally transformed from a Cold War champion of non-alignment into an absolute powerhouse, a dynamic, multipolar global superpower. And this quote right here brilliantly illustrates the secret to how they pull it off. The Indian culture is a culture of debate. Swami Vivekananda said that, and it perfectly connects India's modern status as a loud, pluralistic, deliberative democracy directly back to its ancient roots. For millennia, this civilization has been shaped by diverse interpretations of sacred texts, by rigorous debate, and by a remarkable tolerance for varied beliefs. That innate capacity to synthesize immense diversity, that is exactly what makes its modern democracy function on such a staggering scale.
But as we wrap up, it leaves us with a pretty profound thought to ponder. As the nation homogenizes its markets and projects a unified national identity on the world stage, we have to ask, as India rises as a global superpower, can it maintain the incredible, vibrant local diversity that defined its past 4,000 years? It's a question of synthesis that, frankly, only the future can answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.